I lost my job a couple months ago when the entire business I worked for abruptly went bankrupt and shut down. To make ends meet, I started driving for Uber late into the night. It was about 3:30 or 4 a.m. when I made the last drop-off on the night it happened. The passenger was a strange, quiet man with a greasy t-shirt. His brown eyes looked flat and dead. I glanced into the rearview mirror as I dropped him off at a Victorian house in the middle of nowhere, making sure he left my car so he could wander off and wear a mask made of human skin or whatever people like that did on their days off. The house looked like something from a horror movie, all sharp turrets and dark windows with a blood-red exterior. Dawn came early that day, a cancerous orange sky looming overhead. Needles of rain abruptly started raining sideways. Tired and hungry, I kept an eye out for somewhere to stop and eat as I drove through the filthy torrents of rain. I turned on the GPS for my apartment and sped through the dirty and empty streets of Frost Hollow. Dark, dead trees rose overhead on both sides of me. I drove on for a few minutes, seeing only a single house far back at the beginning of the road that entire time. I didn't know this area, so I was pleasantly surprised when a bright lit diner appeared on my left. A blinking sign cheerily read, "Happy's Restaurant." The parking lot was entirely empty, except for a truck that looked like it had been there for weeks. Leaves and dirt covered its windshield, and someone had written, "Clean me," in the grime in giant letters. I heaved a deep yawn as I pulled into the parking lot. I tried to check my phone, but there was no internet or service all the way out here. I hoped they had Wi-Fi in the diner. Happy's Restaurant had enormous plate glass windows wrapping around the sides and front of the restaurant. Light burst out onto the dark parking lot in a harsh white streams as birds chirp in the forest around me, waking up to the new dawn. The architecture of the place looked straight out of the 1950s. I could imagine James Dean going there and chain-smoking cigarettes over a burger and coffee. I got out of the car, heading over to the front of the restaurant, where I lit a cigarette and inhaled deeply. The spicy menthol tobacco gave me a sudden jolt of energy. Blinking quickly, I smoked the cigarette as quickly as I could, feeling wide awake by the end of it. I stood under the canopy of the building, watching lightning erupt like missile flashes across the sky. The street remained dead and empty. I hadn't seen a single other person since I had dropped off the weirdo at the nearby Victorian house. I opened the glass door of the diner, hearing a bell ring overhead. I looked into the empty restaurant, seeing its sparkling, clean tables. The smell of fresh coffee rose out in fragment waves. Shrugging, I went down and sat at a table next to a TV in the corner. It was playing some 24-hour news channel talking about a mass breakout in a nearby mental asylum. 2 patients of Grey Path Psychiatric Hospital were able to break out by murdering a doctor and taking a nurse hostage. They had apparently planned the attack for weeks, making homemade knives out of screws, taking out the walls and other contraband that went undetected. The facility considered a maximum security hospital, where the majority of patients considered criminally insane and held until, "Hey, sorry bud, didn't see you there." A voice called out from the back of the empty restaurant. I jumped, turning to see who was speaking. A man came out in a streaked, dirty apron. He was incredibly fat, probably at least 300 or 400 pounds. 4 greasy chins hung down on his neck like the wattles of a rooster. He reminded me of a circus freak, a slug-like man whose heavy footsteps shook the ground as he approached my table. He had red hands like a butcher. His face, too, was red-beat and covered in sweat, with a tiny nose in the middle and giant rubbery lips. His name tag said Frank. "Morning," he mumbled. "What can I get for you? Our waiter never showed up, so I'm the only guy here. I'll have to take your order and cook it if that's okay." I nodded happily. "Yeah, that's fine. I just want a coffee with extra cream and sugar, and a Reuben with fries and an extra side of coleslaw." He wrote it down on a dirty streak pad. He pulled from his apron, taking a very long time and writing as slowly as possible. I watched his face closely. He reminded me of a clown, but his eyes were gray, the color of steel. They seemed freezing cold, almost inhuman. There was nothing clownish about them. "Okay, bud, I'll be right up," he said, grinning down at me. His yellow teeth were covered in a thick layer of filthy grime. I noted that some in the front were broken, as if he had the habit of getting his teeth knocked out in fights. He turned around, heading back into the kitchen in a strange, wheedling gait. I wondered how Frank had gotten here. There was certainly no public transportation anywhere in this part of the state, but I figured he must have gotten dropped off. I looked down at my phone, hoping to find an open Wi-Fi connection to pass the time, but there was nothing here. Sighing, I looked around the restaurant. A creepy clown mannequin stood in the corner, holding a sign that read, "Be happy, eat those feelings away." Its red and white makeup was all sharp points and hard angles. Around its grinning mouth, the red paint formed into a pointed half circle, accentuating the gleam white teeth that shone between its thin lips. A few moments later, Frank came out with a steaming hot cup of coffee and a bowl of creamers and sugar packets. He plopped them down in front of me, grunting and ambling back towards the kitchen. I smelled the odor of roasting meat and cooking oil rising from the kitchen in delicious, aromatic waves. I couldn't wait for my Reuben. Out of all the sandwiches in the history of sandwiches, I thought Reubens were probably the most delicious. The way the corned beef mixed with a Thousand Island dressing, sauerkraut, and marble rye bread made it seem like those ingredients were made by God specifically to make such a divine sandwich. My stomach growled as I waited eagerly. I continued scanning the restaurant, listening to the hum of the TV next to me, when I spotted what looked like spatters of blood in front of the swinging kitchen doors. I used to work in a restaurant when I was a teenager, a crappy little pizza place, and I remembered how the ground beef always came soaked in wet blood. I found it odd that no one had cleaned it up yet, though. It looked like dried and clotted, as if it'd been there for days. The TV was still talking about the escaped mental patients when Frank brought out a giant plate of delicious Frank Grant sandwich and golden fries. I could feel my mouth watering as he laid out with a clunk on the table in front of me. "Enjoy, buddy," he said, giving me a sly wink. His fish-like lips formed into a faint half-smile. He turned away, and I immediately dug in. The Reuben was probably the best Reuben I ever tasted. The corned beef was perfectly cooked, the bread crisp and fresh. The fries were golden and had a nice, satisfying crunch. I wanted to compliment Frank, but he was nowhere to be seen. Shrugging, I finished off the first half of my sandwich. As I got the last bite, I noticed something odd and crunchy in the meat. I thought it was a coin or something at first. I immediately spit out the entire wad of a half-chewed sandwich onto a napkin, looking down. In the middle of a meat sat a painted human fingernail. It was ripped off, the bottom jagged and sharp. At that moment, I felt a sudden urge to vomit. I sat there for a few seconds, simply staring, my mind racing in circles like a rat in a wheel. Was it a fake fingernail? How had it gotten into my sandwich? I picked it up, bringing it closer to my right eye. I saw black, clotted blood and thin strands of flesh still hanging from the bottom. It was definitely not fake. Rising quickly, I grabbed my cards and phone off the table and started stumbling towards the door. There were no rational thoughts at that moment, just an insistent rising sense of panic and dread. That was the moment the lights at the diner cut out. An eerie, gurgling laugh floated out the kitchen. The cancerous yellow light of the new day was filtering through the stormy clouds. I looked through the plate glass front door and saw a face peering in with wide, insane eyes. I recognized that man I had dropped off at the Victorian house down the road. He had carved a fresh question mark into his forehead sometime after I had last seen him. His face looked slack and empty as he stared inside, his dead, blank eyes roaming left and right, looking for someone. Looking for me. In his right hand, I saw an enormous meat cleaver streaked with fresh, dripping blood. He raised a trembling hand and started opening the door. In the darkness and silence of the diner, I could hear every sound amplified 1,000-fold, every drop of rain hitting the roof, every thud beat of my heart, every tiny creaking of the door as it swung open. I heard the doors to the kitchen swing open at the same time. In terror, I frantically looked around, seeing the bathrooms only a few feet away in the corner of the restaurant. As silently as I could, I slunk towards them, afraid to look back. I ripped open the woman's restroom door, peeking out as I closed it behind me. I could see the man holding the meat cleaver slowly creeping past the tables, bending over to check underneath them. I could hear him whispering to himself, "I must baptize them in the blood and send them back into the world." He muttered quietly, "Must find the blood, eat the body, drink the blood to see God." Silently, I closed the door and groped around in the dark until I found the lock. Inhaling deeply, I clicked it to the side. The subtle clicking noise seemed loud as a gunshot in the distance. I took my cell phone out of my pocket and turned, seeing a scene from a nightmare. Corpses littered the floor of the bathroom. A waitress in a button-up vest sat up against the wall in a corner. She looked to be in her mid-20s, with dark brown eyes, black hair, and pale creamy skin. Dozens of deep stab wounds gleamed in her chest and stomach. Her neck had been so deeply slashed that her head had nearly been decapitated. Even worse, I saw chunks of flesh cut out of her body, chunks from the meat of her cheeks, arms, legs, and fingers. I suddenly had a very good idea where the fingernails had come from and what I had been eating. I gagged, retching. Next to her sprawled the corpse of an old man in a business suit. His shirt and jacket had been ripped open, and a giant question mark carved deeply into the loose skin of his bird-like chest. Stuck in one eye, I saw the gleam of a wicked butcher's knife. It had been sliced the eye in half, the blade disappearing deeply into his brain and skull. The other eye stared glassily up at the ceiling. I heard a light tapping at the bathroom door, a kind of polite knocking that someone might use if they were wondering if it was occupied. I was afraid to breathe. I spun, looking at the wooden door, the only thing standing between me and certain death at that moment. "Is anyone there?" a low, raspy voice asked, the same voice that had mumbled about drinking blood. "Occupado?" "Hey, question mark, what the fuck are you doing?" the gruff voice of Frank asked. "Did you find him?" His tone rose into one utter excitement, like a child on his way to Disney World. "The bathroom's locked," the question mark replied. "I think we got a little lamb in there, ready for slaughter." "Ready for the grill, you mean?" Frank said, giving an insane laugh that reminded me of the coldness of empty space. I turned, running over to the old man's corpse. The game was up. I knew. I wrapped my hands around the sticky, blood-coated handle of the butcher's knife. I started pulling up, but it was firmly implanted into the old man's skull. At that moment, I heard a sound that sent waves of terror dancing up my spine. The sound of keys jingling in a lock. A rush of adrenaline made the world brighten, and my vision turned white in the harsh glare of the phone's light. I laid the phone down on top of the toilet and, with all of my strength, yanked up on the knife. There was a cracking noise, then a wet sucking sound as blood sprayed my face and neck. The knife slipped out in a rush, sending me flying back. At that moment, the door flew open. Frank and question mark stood there side by side, two grinning lunatics with knives in their hands. The orange light from the sunrise dimly illuminated their silhouettes. They looked over where the cell phone lay on the toilet, not seeing me leaning against the back wall, breathing heavily and an animal panic. Before they had time to react, I ran forwards, the blade facing out towards my attackers. Question mark turned towards me at the last second as I brought the knife into his throat. It sliced easily into the flesh. His eyes widened in pain and surprise as he gurgled, choking on his own blood. He tried to bring the meat cleaver up, but his foot slipped on the slick blood coating the floor. I yanked the knife back out, turning to Frank. I saw a flash of metal and felt something pierce deeply into the side of my stomach. A roaring pain like acid burning its way through my flesh, screaming as warm spurts of blood shot out from the stab wound. I ran at Frank with the last of my energy, stabbing upwards into his belly and aiming at his aorta in the center. We fell into each other, both critically injured. The blood burst from his ruptured artery, spurting like a fire hose in each rapid beat of his heart. His eyes rolled up in his head as he fell back, landing on the corpse of Question Mark. Staggering and leaning against the wall, I tried making my way towards the front of the store, but felt energy draining out of me like water through a sieve. Waves of agony crashed through my body, taking my breath away. I collapsed to my knees, crawling slowly towards salvation. Frothy bubbles of blood flowed over my lips as I coughed, choking. I heard sirens in the distance, approaching rapidly. It sounded like dozens of police cars were heading in our direction. Screaming and crying, I dragged myself towards the front door, leaving warm streaks of blood smeared across the restaurant floor. The gurgling death gasp of Frank rattled noisily behind me. I could feel my life draining out of the deep stab wound in the side of my stomach. As I reached the door, police cars came into the restaurant parking lot with a screeching of tires. Men began running out with their guns drawn. The world went black as I reached up towards the door, wanting only to get out of this restaurant and never see this town again. I woke up in the hospital a couple days later. Emergency surgery had stopped the bleeding, and many blood transfusions had saved my life. Police were waiting around my bed as I regained consciousness, frantic to ask me questions. I told them I didn't know anything, that I had just stopped at the restaurant to eat and gotten attacked. We had gotten multiple missing persons report over the last couple weeks, the gruff homicide detective with a face like a bulldog said, but we didn't connect the victims to the diner until the day we found you there. Both of the escaped patients are dead, though, thanks to you. He patted me on the shoulder. I shook my head, too weird to respond. If only they had investigated sooner, I could have avoided this entire nightmare. But then again, I wouldn't have tasted the best Reuben sandwich in the universe either.